It was a rainy afternoon in Oxford, the kind of English drizzle that seemed to blur the boundaries between centuries-old stone walls and the restless young minds gathered inside them. The Grand Lecture Hall at the university was packed beyond capacity, filled with professors in press suits, students eager for intellectual combat, and a handful of international guests whose presence was more symbolic than expected to be disruptive. Among them sat a quiet man, unassuming in demeanor, but with eyes that scanned the room like someone who had already lived through wars of words and worlds. The conference was titled Civilization, Roots, Routes, and Responsibilities. A prestigious gathering meant to explore the lineage of human progress, a showcase of Western academia at its most self-assured. At the podium stood Professor Edmund Harrington, a man whose name carried weight in Eurocentric historical circles. With a voice polished by years of lecturing, he began what many expected to be a predictable, self-congratulatory discourse on the evolution of civilization. But then came the moment. With a calmness that almost masked the arrogance behind it, Harrington paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at the audience. "Let us be honest," he said. "Africa has contributed virtually nothing to the advancement of civilization as we know it. Its legacy, if one dares to call it that, is largely oral, tribal, and underdeveloped. No philosophy, no architecture of lasting value, no written law of note. Just rhythm and folklore." For a split second, the room didn't react. Perhaps the audience thought it was a provocation, a satirical device, something meant to be followed by a twist, a disclaimer, or a laugh. But none came. Just the cold continuation of a speech laced with centuries of buried prejudice, now exposed under academic lighting. Then came the silence, not the thoughtful, reflective kind, but the stunned, suffocating stillness that descends when a taboo is not only broken but shattered in the heart of an institution that prides itself on enlightenment. A few students exchanged glances, others looked down, unsure whether to challenge or endure. Some professors shifted in their seats, their smiles frozen like masks at a ball where the music had just stopped mid-note. And yet, amidst the tension, one man remained strikingly still. Ibrahim Traoré, the young transitional president of Burkina Faso, whose invitation to the conference had seemed more ceremonial than substantive, slowly leaned forward in his seat. There was no visible change in his expression, no anger, no smirk, just a quiet tightening of the eyes, as if he had heard this all before, perhaps in textbooks that erased his ancestors, or in negotiations where his people were spoken about, not with. What no one knew at that moment was that Oxford was about to witness, not a rebuttal, but a reckoning. Not from a scholar with 1,000 footnotes, but from a soldier-turned-statesman with 1,000 years of stolen history behind him. The silence was not an ending. It was the inhale before a storm. And in the storm's eye stood a man who, with no script and no privilege of cultural dominance, would speak, not to defend Africa, but to restore her memory. At first, he didn't move. Ibrahim Traoré remained still in his chair, hands resting calmly on the table in front of him, his eyes fixed on the stage where Professor Harrington was now sipping water as if he had just made an obvious point. The applause that followed was not unanimous. It was sparse, awkward, the kind of hesitant clapping that comes from habit, not conviction. But still, it echoed through the hall like an insult. For a moment, it seemed no one would speak. No one dared. Not the students whose ancestors had been trafficked like cattle. Not the academics whose tenure depended on their silence. Not the guests who had traveled across continents only to be reminded, yet again, of the invisible lines still drawn between civilized and other. And then he stood. Traoré rose not like a politician, but like a man carrying the weight of a continent on his back. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't reach for a microphone. He simply stepped forward. The room turned toward him, startled, not by his presence, but by the force of it. No guards, no entourage, just a man in a simple, well-worn suit, who looked more like a teacher from a dusty Sahelian school than the head of a sovereign nation. But when he began to speak, the air in the room shifted. "You speak of civilization," he said, his voice steady, rich, and low. each word landing with the weight of a stone dropped in water. And yet, what you practice is cultural amnesia. He paused, letting that word breathe in the vaulted space. Then he stepped closer to the podium, not to take it over, but to reclaim the moral ground it had just lost. You say Africa has contributed nothing, that our legacy is tribal, oral, and undeveloped. You, sir, are not the first to speak those words. The men who built the ships that dragged millions of my ancestors across oceans whispered those words as they branded human flesh. The colonizers who carved up our lands with straight lines and bayonets told themselves that story as they looted gold, rubber, cocoa, and souls. And now, in the safety of this hall, you repeat them, draped in credentials, dressed in arrogance, forgetting that knowledge is not wisdom, and education without humility is simply another form of conquest. There was a tremor in the room now, not fear, but awakening. Traoré's voice did not rise in anger, but in sorrow, in memory. His English was precise, elegant, and laced with a French-African cadence that made even silence feel eloquent. You speak of philosophy. Have you read Comitian ethics? Do you know of Sebate, the ancient Egyptian teachings on moral order, written before your Plato ever dreamed? You speak of law. Do you know of the Gada system of the Oromo people older than Magna Carta, democratic and just? You speak of architecture. Have you seen the mosques of Jen, the obelisks of Aksum, the pyramids not in Egypt alone but in Nubia, standing in silence because your textbooks do not mention them? He turned then, not to Harrington, but to the students, his voice softening. You are told that Africa is oral, as if that is a flaw. But before the printing press, all the world was oral. We memorized, we sang, we recited across generations. Our griots were not just singers, they were archives, libraries that breathed. And then came the final blow, not of anger, but of moral clarity. You confuse silence with absence. You confuse erasure with emptiness. But Africa remembers. Even when you forget us, we remember ourselves. And we are not asking for your validation. We are reminding you that civilization is not a ladder that Europe alone climbs. It is a river, wide and deep, fed by many streams. And Africa is not at the mouth of that river. We are at its source. The hall fell into a stunned hush. Harrington said nothing. He had no words, not because he was defeated, but because something had been exposed in him, something he could not refute without revealing even more. Traoré did not linger.
He did not bow.
He simply turned and walked back to his seat, his posture unshaken, his presence magnified. And in that moment, the room no longer belonged to Oxford. It belonged to history. And history, at last, was speaking with an African voice. What followed in the hall was not applause. It was reverence, a kind of charged, collective silence that no longer belonged to academia, but to something older, more sacred, a reckoning that had waited centuries to arrive. For a few moments, Ibrahim Traoré sat back down, not as a guest, not even as a president, but as a son of a continent whose voice had echoed through empires long before it was shackled in chains or buried beneath the weight of European maps. But he wasn't done. As if summoned by something deeper than intellect, something ancestral, he stood again, this time not to respond, but to reveal. Not to argue, but to resurrect. The Oxford Hall, with its tapestries of Western glory, now felt like the courtroom of a long-delayed trial. And Africa, long silenced, was calling history itself to the stand. You want to speak of forgotten truths? He began, walking slowly to the center of the stage, not with theatricality, but with the calm gravity of someone unearthing bones from a grave. Let's speak of timelines, because you like timelines, don't you? You place the Renaissance in the 14th century, but do you know that Timbuktu's University of Sankore had thousands of manuscripts, astronomy, mathematics, medicine in the 12th? You praise the Enlightenment, yet centuries before it, the Malian Empire was running trade routes with economic systems so advanced that even gold was measured by dust.
But you don't teach that.
Because you don't remember what you chose to forget. He turned then, not in accusation, but in mournful clarity, his voice neither loud nor soft. It was simply true. You erased our names. You renamed our rivers, our mountains, even our gods. But the Nile still flows north from our heart. The stars above the Sahara still guide the Tuareg. And our ancestors, oh yes, our ancestors still whisper through baobab trees and stone circles older than Stonehenge. The screen behind him, untouched until now, lit up, not with graphics, but with fragments, faded manuscripts from Mali, carvings from Nok, the great Zimbabwean stone city rising from the dust, the bronze heads of Ife staring back across centuries with eyes that remembered when Europe was still building huts of straw. Each image was not proof, but testimony. Not artifacts, but witnesses. Do you know what it means, Traoré continued, to have your memory stolen? To be told that pyramids in Sudan are not real because they do not fit the narrative? That your medicine, practiced for generations in harmony with nature, is primitive, while leeches in Europe were called science. Do you know what it feels like to have your entire history footnoted beneath someone else's conquest? There was no malice in his tone, only the searing ache of truth long silenced. We are told to move on, to let go of the past. But how do you move on when your past is still being rewritten by the hands that once burned it? A young student in the front row, British, no more than 20, lowered his eyes. Not from guilt, but from awakening. For the first time, he was not hearing a lecture. He was witnessing a retrieval, a reclamation. And as Traoré's voice deepened, the room felt less like a university and more like a riverbank where an entire civilization was being reborn. We are not victims, Traoré said finally. And we are not asking for pity. What we demand, what we claim is memory. Not for revenge. Not for applause. But because a tree without roots may bloom once, but it will not survive the storm. And Africa has survived every storm. The screen dimmed. The stage fell quiet. But what had been said now lived in the walls, in the breath of the room, in the eyes of those who came expecting a conference and found a reckoning. No rebuttal was offered. None could be. Not because Traoré had won an argument, but because he had restored something that had been taken, not by logic, but by erasure. And in that moment, the hall was no longer a battleground of ideologies. It was a tombstone being lifted, a name long buried being spoken aloud again. And the wind outside, still rainy, still gray, carried something new across the old stones of Oxford. A memory returning home. And yet, even after the applause returned, hesitant at first, then swelling into something raw and unfiltered, Ibrahim Traoré did not smile. He did not bow, nor did he bask in the attention now clumsily offered by those who had, moments earlier, sat in complicit silence. For he had not come for applause. He had not crossed oceans to perform. He had come for something far older than recognition. He had come for reckoning. He stood at the edge of the stage for a moment longer, as if listening, not to the room, but to something deeper. The breath of ancestors. The murmur of generations silenced by textbooks and treaties. The invisible choir of those whose names had been stripped, whose languages had been beaten from the tongues of their children. And then, in a voice that was both thunder and prayer, he gave his final words, not to Professor Harrington, not even to Oxford, but to the world that had chosen to forget. Do not mistake our silence for surrender. Do not confuse our dignity for weakness. We do not need your permission to exist, to remember, to rise. We are not what was left behind. We are what endures. He turned then not in retreat, but in return. Each step down from the podium was deliberate, as if marking a trail through history itself. Behind him, the images of Africa's stolen grandeur faded from the screen, but not from the minds now awakened. The room no longer buzzed with academic chatter. It pulsed with something heavier.
Shame.
Wonder.
Grief.
But above all, respect. Not the patronizing kind extended in charity, but the trembling kind born of overdue truth. Outside, the rain had ceased. The stone paths of Oxford glistened under a hesitant sun, as if the very sky had been moved by what had transpired within those ancient walls. Traoré walked alone, declining interviews, declining cameras. He was not there to be documented. He was there to speak what needed speaking. And now that it had been said, he carried it with him, quietly, firmly, like a soldier bearing an unseen flag. And as he disappeared beyond the arches, someone in the hall whispered what others could not yet say aloud. That was not just a speech. That was a homecoming. Because on that day, in the heart of an institution built on centuries of exclusion, Africa did not demand entry. Africa walked in uninvited, unbent, and undeniable. And when it spoke, the world remembered, not only what it had taken, but what it could never destroy. Not memory, not truth,
Not dignity.
never again. What happened afterward was not a news cycle, it was a tremor. The kind that doesn't just shake headlines, but foundations. Within hours of Ibrahim Traoré's departure from Oxford, the video of his confrontation, uncut, unfiltered, had gone viral. Not in the sense of digital novelty, but like a suppressed scream that had finally broken through the earth, reverberating across continents. In Dakar and Lagos, in Bamako and Nairobi, in Paris and Baltimore and Kingston, it played in classrooms, cafes, homes, and squares. Not as a spectacle, but as a mirror. Young people watched with clenched jaws and wet eyes, not because they had never heard these truths, but because they had never seen them spoken like that, unapologetic, unscripted, and burning with the fire of someone who had nothing to gain but the dignity of remembrance. Elders wept in silence, as if something lost decades ago had finally been returned. Not reparations, not recognition, but voice. In universities across Africa, professors who had once been ridiculed for teaching pre-colonial excellence now found their syllabi quoted by students who had seen the fire in Traoré's eyes. In Europe, quiet panic stirred in the backrooms of think tanks and boardrooms. Not because they feared violence, but because they feared awakening. For the most dangerous thing a colonizer ever faced was not rebellion, it was memory. At Oxford, Professor Harrington issued a vague, half-hearted apology in a press release, citing miscommunication and unintended cultural insensitivity. But no one cared. The world had already moved on from him. His words, rehearsed and sterile, could not stand against what had been unleashed. The raw, ancestral power of truth told without permission. Inside the university, things changed. A mural once depicting British explorers was quietly replaced by an abstract representation of African constellations. A student-led initiative demanded the repatriation of African artifacts locked in museum glass just meters away from where Traoré had spoken. And at the next academic council meeting, someone softly, then louder, asked why Oxford still didn't have a single mandatory course on the African empires that once rivaled Rome and outshined the Renaissance. The room fell quiet. Something had shifted. Not policy. Not yet. But conscience. And far beyond the campus gates, in the villages of Burkina Faso, in the neighborhoods of Soweto, in the diaspora of Harlem and Brixton, people began to walk taller. Not because oppression had vanished, but because its shadow had been named. Mothers told their children about the kingdoms of Songhai and Aksum not as myths, but as birthrights. Fathers, once weary from silence, began to speak again of their grandfathers, warriors, griots, scholars, whose stories had been buried beneath asphalt and shame. Ibrahim Traoré returned home not as a hero, but as a herald. He refused interviews. He declined invitations to TED Talks and documentaries. "I did not speak to be seen," he told a journalist who caught him at an airport. "I spoke so we would no longer be invisible." And in the silence that followed, movements grew. Quiet at first, then rising. A new African generation, armed not with vengeance, but with archives, with language, with pride, began to rewrite the narratives. Not to erase the past, but to reclaim it. A publishing house in Accra launched a series of children's books retelling history from the perspective of African sages and queens. In Kigali, a filmmaker began shooting a documentary not about colonialism, but about the intellectual systems that survived it. In Brazil, in Haiti, in the streets of Marseille and Cairo, murals sprang up, not of presidents, but of philosophers, poets, and scientists whose names had long been lost under imperial dust. They called it the memory tide. Not a movement, a return. And somewhere in the Sahel, beneath a sky littered with stars as old as time, Ibrahim Traoré walked through his village at dusk. Children ran past him, barefoot and laughing, carrying books instead of burdens. He smiled, not because the world had changed, but because now, finally, it could. The story would not end at Oxford. It never had. That moment was not a climax. It was a spark. And, across the world, in places once stripped of their stories, the fire had caught. Not for war, not for revenge, but for remembrance. And remembrance, once awakened, does not sleep again. They began to call it the Traoré moment. Not in newspapers, those were too slow, too structured. Not on talk shows, those were too shallow, too afraid. But in classrooms whispered by students who had found something sacred in a grainy video. In libraries where young researchers, eyes blazing, flipped through histories rewritten by the silence of empire. In social media threads that defied the algorithms, living like oral tradition, passed from voice to voice, heart to heart. It wasn't just a speech anymore. It became a reference point, a rupture, a quiet revolution of posture and pride. In places where African students once hesitated before raising their hands, they now stood to speak not just as learners, but as inheritors. In institutions once cold with marble and legacy, warm tremors of accountability began to surface. No policy had changed, but everything had shifted. Young poets in Bamenda began performing verses that echoed Traoré's cadence. Painters in Tunis reimagined classical portraits, not of generals or kings, but of mothers holding stories in their eyes. At Howard, a lecturer began her African philosophy course, not with Descartes, but with Queen Nzinga. In Accra, school children now studied Mansa Musa before Columbus. And in Ouagadougou, in a modest high school named after a forgotten revolutionary, a plaque was installed outside the auditorium. It bore a single sentence: "History remembers those who dare to remind it of itself." Governments hesitated. Some feared the awakening, branding it radical, subversive. But even as they debated, even as they wrung their hands in parliaments and think tanks, they could not touch what had already taken root, because it did not live in policy. It lived in memory, in song, in language. It had entered the bloodstream of a people once scattered, now stirred. In European universities, students demanded syllabi that looked more like the globe than the empire. In African ones, a new genre emerged, half scholarship, half testimony, entirely liberation. And always, always, they referenced it. Since Traoré's moment, inspired by Traoré's stance, in the wake of Oxford 2025, no statue was built. He would have hated that. But his words etched themselves into the walls of places that once pretended Africa had no voice, etched not in stone, but in the nervous silence before a young woman stood up and said, "No, let me speak." The elders called it the return of breath, as if a continent had been underwater for centuries and now, finally, was breathing its own air again. You could feel it in music, rhythms less polished, more primal. You could see it in fashion, not mimicry, but memory draped across shoulders. And you could sense it, quietly, in the way people began to name their children, not after presidents, but after poets, after prophets, after ancestors. And still, Ibrahim Traoré remained quiet. He refused foundation offers, turned down honorary degrees. He answered no invitations to panels titled Decolonizing Academia or The New Africa. Instead, he returned to his land, taught children how to listen to the earth, taught them names, ancient, unbroken names that had never passed through a colonial mouth. He once said to a visiting journalist, "If my voice is remembered, let it be as an echo of those who never got to speak. I am not the story. I am the interruption." But across the world, in corridors of power and corners of forgotten lands, that interruption became a drumbeat, a declaration, a refusal to disappear again. They called it the Traoré moment. But in truth, it was never just a moment. It was a beginning. The day the ghosts of empire were summoned, not with bitterness, but with truth. The day a man stood, not to accuse, but to remember. And by remembering, restored something greater than pride. He restored presence. And presence, once returned, reshapes the future, not with fire, but with light. And light, once claimed, does not retreat.